All right, so it looks like we are good to go on our first grand final. This will be the debate. I see all of our judges are present. I see all of our debaters are present. So we will pass this off to the proposer to kick it off.
Okay. Just before I start, I would like my POIs verbally, please. Starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A post-scarcity society gives us freedom, but the point at which that freedom is unlimited, it poses an existential threat. We say we reach that limit at the point we give bigots and psychopaths access to nuclear weapons. That is why we are proud to get rid of this replicator. Firstly, note what this replicator is. One, it can generate any kind of technology that humans have already made. It can't create something new. Secondly, it does this without the requirement of access to those kinds of resources. It just creates it. Secondly, no cost involved in generating. Finally, it has easy access for everyone. We think this is as common as having an oven or a fridge in your house because of the nature of how technology develops. Look at 3D printers, which were once scarce, but now everyone can purchase themselves or some model thereof. We think variety of complexity may differ, but there'll be access to them at a wider range for all individuals. Note, we think at our point in the stance that we won't want these in existence, and we prefer a world in which synthesizers exist and we are far into the future. What do we think this world looks like? One, it's an international galactical federation, meaning we've colonized multiple planets with large expanses of land. Secondly, we have abundance of resources. This is to say that we aren't in any worry of running out of materials. We could simply mine new asteroids or get it on a different planet. Thirdly, we think this is still a highly automated society with most things being done or automated already by complex machinery. We don't think this is a return to the Stone Age or manual labor. Fourth and final thing, we think at this point food synthesizers still exist. So we've managed to deal with global, galactic hunger and lack of water. We think the bare necessities are already so commonly available that regardless of income bracket, it's dirt cheap because of how it can be produced. Firstly, main framework. We don't think this debate is going to be a question about severe manual labor or indentured servitude because one, it's inefficient and compared to robots who can do the tasks for us already. We think this debate primarily focuses on a comparative web in which a world where we can produce something instantly versus where we need mechanisms of production and there isn't common access to it to the same extent for complex things within society. That's the world that opposition needs to defend. In this speech, I'll be giving you two main things in substantive. Firstly, why it poses an existential threat to human existence, and secondly, why it stagnates innovation. I'll be comparing all of these for you later. My second speaker will be giving you analysis on why this is a global risk in terms of pollution and other kinds of wildlife within the solar system. Let's move on to the first point of substantive. Note the first fact, there will still be group tensions. This means there are still going to be bigots and racists in the world. And secondly, planets or countries are still going to feud and want to fight with each other. Secondly, the point at which these things can generate matter, they can generate anything without restriction. The problems you run into is twofold. Analysis, I'm going to be giving you three layers. Firstly, on the macro level, the point at which we give access to large groups of people with replicators. This means a guerrilla force can arm themselves with hundreds of tanks and nuclear weapons at the click of a button. This point, we know that conflict is going to escalate. There's going to be more fighting between humans because it's instant access to most potent technology. There will be war with any group that has severe disagreement. Second point of analysis, the fact that we still have bigots and people who are going to commit crimes of passion or crimes of hatred. The issue at this point means that we can't regulate their access to dangerous weaponry. This looks like someone who wants to perform a mass shooting simply printing out an AK-47 or a tank which they can roll into a synagogue with. We think at this point in which we have an existential threat to the people in society who are psychopathic or simply bigoted and want to do others harm. We can't regulate that in their world. I'll take you to the end of this substantive. Third and final level under the substantive. The point at which you have access to this, we can no longer control the kinds of things produced. This means that we can't regulate things that should be harmful to you and the government's responsibility to prevent addiction and help people in terms of preventing you from accessing cocaine or making sure the level of addictiveness in nicotine isn't as high in cigarettes. We think at this point when you can print this, we have failed in our mandate to protect you from addictive substances. The impacts of this is twofold. One, a higher rate of violence and damage, and two, a more limitation for your lack of protections through government mechanisms. On the comparative, we recognize that certain people are going to be able to access more things and maybe actualize their lives to a greater extent. But we think this becomes a comparative way up when we have more damage to life, more people being hurt, and more war. If the argument is against capitalism, which strips you of resources, the point at which we favor few at the cost of loss of lives as any, they've failed in their burden and they're principally unsound. Before I move to my second point, yes, I'll take the POI.
First of all, you're trying to use this like giving psychopaths access to nuclear weapons as a sort of trump card in this debate. And the debate becomes completely undebatable if like this technology is completely unregulated. Second of all, even if you believe that like, look, that is a trump card and that's reasonable and within the bounds of this debate, we also think that it's reasonable in a world where you can just actualize a nuclear weapon. We also think that it's reasonable to assume that our governmental crime fighting capability is better and can stop people from committing crime before it actually happens.
Okay, even at the point at which that's reasonable, firstly, the debate itself is non-regulation. If it's common access, you can produce it before we can get there. But secondly, even in that case, it were to be true, we think there'd be a constant war about it. And by the time you get to someone with a nuclear weapon, it's already too late. But let's go into the next argument of substantive. Note at the point that development is still needed within our society because there'll still be issues we need to face. Cancer is still a thing. We might find new kinds of space diseases. We don't know what the realities will be. At the point at which the analysis says that you no longer have a profit incentive because you can't patent something and then sell it afterwards. There's no reason to invest or do any kind of research. There's no capitalistic incentive anymore because the point at which you make a new computer, everyone prints it out. Therefore, you just print what you already have. We think when you get to this point, there's a stagnation of innovation within society. Secondly, general consensus and gov research or altruistic individuals, that's still going to exist in both sides of the house. We think at that point, we still have mutually more incentives in order to do development and actual research within society. The impacts of this is twofold. Firstly, that in this world, we have a society that generally just has more innovation, which is able to help with existential future threats. And secondly, we can deal with issues such as cancer. If you stand on the side that worries about safety of individuals and a world where we don't trade others' rights for our own, if you worry about innovation, you stand with side proposition. Proud to propose.
Okay, and after the proposition first speaker, we'll invite the opposition first speaker to continue today's debate. Whenever you're ready, you can begin.
All right. I'm just setting up my timer. All right, we're good. Speaker, it's on the basis that we believe in a less materialistic, less capitalist, and much more conflict-free and peaceful society that we're so proud to stand on the side opposition bench. Firstly, in my speech, I'm going to be going over some quick refutation of what we heard out of Eugene in his first speech, refuting his two constructive points. First, basically this whole point that like, look, people are going to have unregulated, unmitigated access to whatever they want and are going to be really, really violent and stuff with it. And secondly, talking about how there's no profit incentive to innovate. So let's hear what Eugene had to say about basically his points that was sort of like titled like, look, we're going to give psychopaths and bigots access to nukes. First of all, we think that like it's really unfair for them to sort of use this as like a trump card in this debate by saying like, look, we're getting psychopaths access to nukes, like therefore this debate should fall. Obviously, we all think that giving psychopaths access to nukes and bigots access to like weapons of mass destruction is a really, really awful idea that we really don't want to have. This is a trump card that they're trying to use in this debate, and we're not going to let them use it. Because secondly, we believe, like I pointed out in a POI, that if this technology exists, if it's basically possible to wish a nuke into existence, it's also possible for the government or regulating body to see that a nuke has been wished into existence and stop it from being a threat and arrest the person or sort of apprehend the person before their crime is committed. We believe that, like, look, if technology is on this level where you can create weapons of mass destruction out of demand, it's also reasonable to assume that crime fighting technology has evolved to the same extent to prevent crime before it even happens. As a result of this. So as a result of this impacts of like sort of like an extra conflict sort of world and like rampant crime, etc., really weaken out of the fact that, like, look, we have the capacities as a society that's advanced enough to wish weapons into existence. We also have the capacity to regulate those weapons and make sure that people do not commit crime. Our crime fighting technology has also evolved. Secondly, he also talked about how there's no profit incentive to innovate. My partner's constructive is going to be dealing a lot with this and actually talking about how that's actually a win on our side about the need to innovate. But basically the thesis, I don't want to step on his toes too much, but basically his thesis is that, like, look, we're going to lead to better innovation because that innovation is driven by fulfillment rather than profit incentive. Before I get into my two constructive points, talking about the principle of money becoming less valuable and a less conflict in society, I'll take a POI.
Note there's no response to that argument in terms of the armament of large groups or the risk of individual regulation of products. But even if that were to be true in our only level, if you can produce moonshine or something like that and you know it's happening, there's still conflict to try and apprehend them. If I have an AK, you're not going to magically take it out of my hands. I'm going to shoot and hurt some people.
All right. Okay. So look, basically your point remains the same, right? But you say, like, look, I have an AK, look, there is going to be some amount of conflict, but we believe that it's not going to be an excessive amount of conflict like you talk about earlier. And it may not even necessarily be more, because I'm going to be talking about how it actually lessens the likelihood of conflict, since most conflict is actually driven by lack of access to material goods. All right, let's talk about the principle. The thesis of this point basically boils down to this. If everyone has equal access to material goods and luxuries, which are seen as valuables only because not everyone has them, then there will be less value and emphasis placed on them. Why are Air Jordans valuable? Because they're rare. Rivalry and exclusivity are how humans define what is valuable and what is not. With replicator technology, that rivalry and exclusivity disappears, making material goods and money not as valuable in society at all. In the status quo, what do we define success as? We define success as material, how many cars you own, how big your house is, etc. In a world where everyone has access to these things, equal access to these things, they're no longer our marker of success because everyone has them. There's nothing that differentiates you and your neighbor because both of you have the access to the exact same things. All right, let's talk about some impacts. No more POIs. Let's talk about some impacts of this. The first and major impact is, look, it means that people will find other ways of self-fulfillment rather than just materialist success. We think that they're more likely to go on a life that is fulfilled by happiness and rather than monetary or material success. Since material well-being is of little importance in less society, since its value is effectively nothing, since everyone has access to the basics, everyone has access even to the most expensive luxuries, people will no longer have to sacrifice their happiness for their material, societal, capitalist definition of success. They already have a nice house, they already have access to necessities, therefore they're going to focus on their own individual happiness as a marker of success. Secondly, it leads to more innovation. Again, my partner is going to be talking about this. And thirdly, it leads to a society driven more by happiness and self-fulfillment rather than being better than the other person. It's not about competitiveness. It's more about self-fulfillment, intrinsic success rather than external success. All right, so let's talk quickly about how there's going to be less conflict and exploitation in our society. So the thesis of this point is, like, look, most conflict is caused by the lack of access to resources. Even though it's a post-scarcity society, there will still be some planets and some areas who have access to all of one resource and are buying and selling that. Even Eugene admits to that because there are capitalist profit incentives. Monopoly will still exist in the system and be desirable because wherever there's a free market system, there will be a benefit to being a monopolist. So naturally, planets and people are going to look to have control over all of one resource so that they can sell it at a price of whatever they want. So how will people create this monopoly or access to the resources? Through conflict and exploitation. It's basically this: I want this, you have this, I'm sick of paying for it, I'm going to take over your planet. Literally, the essence of colonization was this simple factor. We think that it's likely in their world too. In our world, we eliminate that conflict because material well-being is of no importance. Everyone has equal access. Because we eliminate material definitions of success and lead to less conflict, so proud to oppose.
Okay, the speakers use 6 minutes and 30 seconds. Thank you for the fine speech. And now we move on to the proposition's second speaker. If you have any preferences for POI, can you please state them before your speech?
I would prefer if you have a POI, just raise your hand. If I don't respond to you, you can feel free to go verbal. It's just because my Wi-Fi is not exactly the best.
Okay, thank you.
Panel, just listen to the language that Vishwa uses in his first argument, that in their world, there will be no difference between you and your neighbor. They never substantiate why that's a good thing. On our side, Eugene and I actually argue there's immense value to using material goods to feel special. There is immense value to having a certain sense of specialty revolving around the goods that you do have instead of just producing everything willy-nilly. I'm going to talk about a few points of clash, then introduce a third argument on the value of control of production. Okay, in terms of clash, the first thing I want to bring back is what Eugene told you in his first speech, which is that this technology is likely to be weaponized by different individuals, for instance, to produce en masse weapons or illicit substances. All they say on their side is, first of all, that this isn't in the spirit of the motion. I implore you to look at the actual wording of the motion. It literally just says users can generate whatever product they want in a post-scarcity society, which indicates as long as these weapons of mass destruction, for instance, have already been created and invented by humanity, we are able to say people can weaponize that and just create more of those on our side. But the more promising response that they give is that since we can already have created these technologies in the first place, we presumably also have the technology to regulate the production. They give no mechanism for this. I want to just point out, the reason you can regulate in the status quo, whether or not someone can, for instance, get an atomic bomb, is because you can cut them off in the chain of supply. So for instance, the United States can cut off Iran's enriched uranium plants and stop them from gaining an atomic weapon because they can stop them in the process of supply. On their side, you have unpredictable things where you just, in a snap of a finger, reproduce a certain material. It is an unrelentlessly accelerated version of production. It's fast, and they give no mechanism for how you can even regulate anything on their side of the house. I want to now talk, though, about the other point that Vishwa gives you toward the last minute of the speech that he just kind of throws out, which is that individuals on their side are less basically on the hedonistic treadmill of consumerism. Therefore, they look towards intrinsic forms of success and happiness instead of just relying on the drive to pursue material goods. Two observations here. First of all, we already pointed out that the worst forms of capitalism, for instance, exist when big businessmen preclude poor communities, for instance, from achieving the goals that they need for survival. So for instance, blocking off people's access to water or limited resources for food and agrarian farmland. In a post-scarce society, which by the way exists on either side of the house, we already mitigate significantly the harms of that. So for instance, you already have access to food, water, and resources that are essential to survival. Those are available on either side of the house. They cannot just claim the worst impacts that could ever happen. But the second thing I want to note is the motion says that this debate takes place in literally the 24th century. Just think about how, now that we're in the 21st century, how far since the last 3 centuries, since the 18th century we've come. We've literally gone from having horse-drawn carriages on dirt roads and dumping sewage into random rivers to harvesting literal solar energy and running self-driving cars. Give us another 3 centuries, coupled with the already accelerating rate of innovation, and we think already the negative impacts of materialistic demands, consumerism, and capitalism are heavily mitigated insofar as people aren't going to be reduced to like working in factories, etc. They're working in like maintenance jobs, etc. That's the frame we already kind of implied in first that they needed to adapt their case to, which didn't actually happen on their side of the house. But then the other argument that Vishwa throws out in the last minute of his speech is one about monopolies, that basically people still want to compete for resources and that on their side of the house, they somehow stop people from having like that manifest in a horrible way. I would posit that this actually arguably gets worse on their side. The reason is that if everyone perceives that there's a threat of anyone just coming in and replicating the very little resources that you do have, for instance, in your little planet or so, they're going to try their best to hog what little inventions or innovations they do have. So if I have, for instance, a really cool technology like a computer, for instance, I'm going to try to monopolize that even harder. So for instance, another planet also in the Federation of Planets cannot just come in and replicate it for their own economic gain. That is the point at which these tensions they point out exist on our side just get all the more worse on their side. I now want to talk, though, about a third argument for our side of the house on the value of control. And we think, actually, that there's immense value in not just being able to replicate whatever product our heart desires, whenever our heart desires to replicate that product. I'm going to have 3 layers of analysis here. And the third layer of analysis is also going to directly engage with Vishwa's point on consumerism. The first layer of analysis is in terms of environmental harms, because we think when it becomes so unbelievably easy and effortless to come into possession of a product, we have way less of an appreciation of each individual one of those products. There's something psychological about us that then stimulates us to excessively easily produce these products. So therefore, we're far more likely to exorbitantly summon these products en masse at the point at which you can just, in a snap of a finger, automatically replicate that product. This is, for instance, why in the status quo, absent the existence of this technology, it's easier for us to take napkins from a hotel buffet than it is to take it from a family pantry. It's just, we have to go through less psychological loopholes in order to take it from the buffet. Therefore, we're more likely to extract absorbently. But here's the problem. On their side of the house, they have so many expendable products that people might just get things for the fun of it, just because they have access to this technology. So you can make like random gadgets and toys, etc. Once you then discard of those things, then you create a far more polluted world, insofar as you just have like more machinery just floating around in random intergalactic places. And no, maybe perhaps we are in a post-scarcity world, but it's still just objectively less enjoyable to have a bunch of pollution floating around the galaxy that you live in, especially because this is likely to harm vulnerable communities who are going to be forced to deal with the negative effects of this pollution, or be forced to contend with actually dealing with sanitation, etc. I would draw an analogy to the status quo I'll take in a moment, where, for instance, people in Bangalore of India are forced to deal with most of the Earth's pollution when India's trash, for instance, and plastic trash goes into the rivers, because it's always the most vulnerable groups that are used as a dumping ground. They're the ones that have to deal with all your harms, waiting on their side of the house, while galactic tycoons and overlords indulge in consumerism, get fancy gadgets and machinery. Everyone else has to contend with a world in which there's just objectively more materialistic products floating around and making life worse for everyone else. The second layer of analysis, though, is on a psychological and an individual level, because we think you lose out on the feeling of specialness when everything can just be produced en masse with no sort of effort whatsoever. In the status quo, you have a certain process of acquisition. You have a journey of, for instance, getting a product that makes you have a unique sort of attachment to that product. Maybe that product has sentimental value. Maybe it's unique. Maybe it's a famous piece of artwork that just should not be replicated willy-nilly because it was made by some famous painter that you just think there's immense value to that through scarcity. Obviously, though, this value and scarcity just doesn't apply when it comes to basic survival needs, for instance, like food and water, etc. But we pointed out that's accounted for on either side of the house. What you get on their side is slews of material goods just arising out of oblivion. You create a colorless void in which no one really appreciates the things they do have in the world. Before I move on to the third and final harm that I want to point out in this argument, Vishwa, you can go ahead.
All right. So first of all, assuming that we can snap things into existence, I think it's also reasonable to assume that look, we have a robust way of dealing with waste that isn't like what we do right now. Secondly, when you're talking about the scarcity of rare things like paintings or certain objects that are rare, they are still valuable because they're originals rather than the ones that were snapped into existence.
Right. Thank you for giving two POIs somehow in one. So the first thing about dealing with waste, obviously, you, for instance, have less scarcity in terms of land mass and you have more planets. That doesn't change the fact that on net, you just inject so much more waste into the world, especially because there's such a huge population. You cannot regulate how many people are just going to suddenly en masse produce so many things. But furthermore, our argument isn't just about originals. I can have an Apple MacBook that isn't original right now. I still have an attachment to it because I actually went through a process of acquisition. You reduce that on your side. But the third thing is that on their side, they feed into the constant drive to keep replicating things, and therefore you feed into the hedonistic treadmill of consumerism in the first place. Because you keep placing this artificial value on materialistic goods, you tell everyone that because this machine is so great, it's presumably because of the fact that it can manufacture all these goods with you. So you create in the public perception this cultural obsession with just producing more and more and more materialistic goods to the point where society is just so preoccupied with continuing to indulge in consumerism. Therefore, it's still the people with access to this technology that are the happiest, that can keep compounding on their benefit that exists in the status quo. On all those grounds, it's a very clear ballot for the proposition. Thank you.
Thank you. We thank the speaker for that fine speech. It was 9 minutes and 15 seconds. And now we move on to the opposition's second speaker. Whenever you're ready, you can begin and you can indicate your preference for POIs before that.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, my preferred POI is through the mic. So if you guys have any, just mic in. Okay. If everyone's ready, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Side proposition says, hey, in your world, anyone can just create nukes and create weapons, and that's why it's a menace to society. This is the same side proposition that emphasizes how advanced the technologies are already being in their world. The moment in which proposition makes this their core of the case is where you lose this debate entirely. Because if replicator technology actually already existed, why would we not have a regulation in that first place, right? I don't understand any government that would suddenly just donate all of these out to everybody when they know clearly that they can make some kind of nukes with it, right? I don't think that analysis logically makes sense on their side of the house anyways. Replication is dedication, which is why I'm so proud to oppose. Couple of things in my speech. I'm going to be first going into some extraneous rebuttals to the entire bench of proposition. I'm going to be asking 2 questions. The first one being which side has more danger, and the second one being which side provides a better quality of life. And then finally moving on to our final substantive on more innovation and more sustainable future on the comparative. Moving on to some rebuttals then, because they said some really interesting things down the bench. The first thing they say is that things will be cheap, so a lot of people can buy more things. Hiller's response. First of all, no, absolutely not, because recognize that their side still lives under a monopoly, right? Because that means that money prices don't actually drop because their side of the house, on the comparative, have corporations that still exist, have people with money incentives that they already conceded under their side of the house, which means that these people who are money hungry probably aren't going to drop the price a lot more, right? But second response, even if it was, I would say the standard of life doesn't actually change, because recognize how they still have a socioeconomic ladder. With that, we would say the perception of the quality of life also changes under each like different status quo under their side of the house, which means that even if they think, as we think right now, that their standard of life will be better than the people living in poverty right now, it's a lot different when you're actually in that situation and when other people have a lot more luxury than you. No, thank you. But they also say that we pollute the environment. I would say they actually pollute a lot more. Why? Because literally their argument was that people make things for fun. Compare that to what they need to deal with, right? People constantly consuming to display material wealth. I don't think they can win under the argument of pollution as well. 2 questions then. The first question on which side has more danger. Moving on to the first question first, because recognize how under their side of the house, probably not all planets are rich in the very first place, right? Just because you have a federation of planets, just because you live in a post-scarcity world, doesn't mean that all planets are equal, all planets are like equally rich. I think meaning that there should be a difference in power between each of them. What this exactly means is that the colonialism thing that my partner already talked about, right? To the extent where raw materials will more likely still exist under their side of the house, where countries that are a lot stronger are able to overpower countries or planets that are a lot weaker than themselves, which means that these weaker planets are disproportionately harmed on their side of the house. But what proposition doesn't understand in today's debate throughout their entire bench is that our side of the house, there is no reason to fight. There is no reason to cause danger in the very first place. I think this has been already very clearly stated by Vishwa, right? But I'm just going to remind you. 2 layers of analysis. No, thank you. I'll take it a bit later. First of all, no one is actually poor, which means that a lot of the times you're not going to have as much revolutions as you will on the their side of the house. There's not a lot of discontent between each members or groups of society. But second of all, we have like literally the greatest level of deterrence that you actually can have, because of why you actually have replication, right? So if you're actually going to wage some kind of war, I think at the very, very worst case, it's going to be a tie. In the their side of the house, this harm still exists because of the fact that conflict will still exist between different planets, right? I think on that fact, and they aren't able to defend that dangers will always exist on their side of the house more than dumb, they already lose today's debate. Before I move on to my second question, sure, I'll take a point.
Won't planets be more likely to enter into conflicts because they feel like it comes at no cost to them, because they don't lose weapons. They just have to press a button a few times and then automatically they can just get all the weapons they want, no cost to them.
Judge, this is literally them showing you how they don't understand our entire case, right? Our case is that there is no reason to fight in the very first place. If they cannot prove that there actually is a reason to fight, they already lose that debate. Moving on to our second question then, which side provides a better quality of life? We would say that a world where worries actually disappear is the world that raises the quality of life. Because recognize our proposition houses a world full of monopolies, conflict, and greed. Why? Because of their concept of money in the very first place, right? First of all, we say people are greedy. They need to show their materialistic wealth, and companies only wish to benefit themselves. People only wish to benefit themselves under their side of the house. When you have this kind of monopolies that actually exist, it's a lot less, it's a lot worse for these kind of people because of the fact that there's a concept of money and they have to keep on benefiting themselves at the end of the day. That means you also disproportionately harm a large group of people who are not able to do so under their side of the house, much like our status quo right now. I would say, even in a post-scarcity world, it is not in proposition's power to fiat that impoverished members of society get food and all of these basic necessities in the first place. Because recognize that rich people will still always be greedy, keeping the poor poor, right?
Why?
Disproportionately harm doesn't exist under our side of the house on the comparative, which is why I think at the very least we're able to take this point home. No, thank you. I'll take you a bit later if I have time. Moving on to our final or substantive then, how we get more innovation and a more sustainable future. This argument is important because I'm going to tell you why even taking proposition at their very best, we will always outweigh in today's debate. Two layers of analysis. First one on increased innovation and the second one on sustainability. Because on the first layer of analysis, recognize how free market right now is driven on a single factor, right? And that factor is money. What this exactly means is that the focus on every single person has in the current market is to get money and that's all, right? And to just become richer. Recognize like this is actually stumping innovation itself. Because if you look at companies like Google monopolizing their market, if you look at companies like Amazon or Facebook, this monopoly disrupts innovation in and of itself. Because why? They always buy out new ideas that they think will be a threat to their competition in the future. Because of that, because of their monopolistic tendencies and because they're so powerful and because they are powerful corporations in the first place, I don't think that disappears under their side of the house anyways, right? Which means when these monopolies already exist under their side of the house, you're also going to harm a lot of these other people that are trying to develop new ideas. You're not going to have as much innovation as we see in the monopolies and as we see in the free market in today's society. This means that under side proposition, where like very strict limitations exist, no new ideas will ever form out of it because the monopolization is just too high. And even when there's interplanet like organizations or like corporations, it's going to be even worse under their side of the house. On the comparative, our side of the house guarantees innovation, not driven by selfish desires and just adding another camera to our phones, but actual innovation that actually help out humanity itself, right? Things like helping out current issues, things like solving inconveniences. I think there's a higher focus on tech and actual cures that will benefit the society. Before I move on to my final point of analysis, I'll take your point.
So in the status quo, it costs money to produce any product anyway. So planets always strive to produce better products. But why would any planet on your side try to make a smarter computer, for instance, when they can just press a button a million times and settle for merely reproducing a subpar product that exists in the status quo?
Okay, recognize how we have already repeated this so many times, right? That once the concept of money disappears, the focus isn't on trying to create something that will benefit yourself and trying to create something that seems unique but actually isn't. The focus will then be on how to actually increase the conveniency that we live in the society, right? I think that point has been made very clear. But what's our second layer of analysis? Talking about sustainability. Actually, this will also address the POI that Angela just gave. Because recognize that side proposition has no guarantee of sustainability. Why? Because of the fact that their world is full of money-hungry corporations. Take creating vaccines or studying new viruses, for example. In medical corporations, vaccines are often not studied as companies lose millions of dollars in research with no guarantee of results. This is extremely bad for these corporations who want to make as much profit as possible, because in that case, they're not going to go study these viruses because they know that they're going to lose out. And there's no guarantee of success for themselves as well. As we see with COVID-19, the only reason why a lot of these companies suddenly jumped in was for profit incentives as well. I think it's very clear under their side of the house how this monopoly will hurt even more companies. But this is side proposition, right? We get rid of this thing, this need for money in the very first place, which means that we shift the focus onto helpful innovation. I think on that purpose, we have more sense of community. We have more sense of actually helping each other out. And on that sense, we're better able to innovate on the level that we're not trying to focus on money, right? Things like vaccines, things like better cures will always exist under our side of the house anyways, because we always see the problem and we're able to solve it further back than they're able to do so. I think we always outweigh side proposition on every level, on both the practical and the principle. On the principle level, as my partner has already told you, the principle of money is being diminished under our side of the house, which means that you focus a lot more on development. On the their side of the house, where there's a monopolization that already exists, planets that are a lot stronger than other planets always have the upper hand and the leverage against those specific planets as well. I think on that case, they always lose out on the terms of principle and also practical, because a lot of the people on the their side of the house will always be disproportionately harmed. I really don't want them to come up in the reply speech and talk about nukes again, because I really don't think that's a viable argument on their side of the house. Replication is dedication, which is why I'm so proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. It was 8 minutes and 59 seconds. So with that concluded, we move on to reply speeches. We'll start with opposition reply, and then we end with proposition reply. So whenever you're ready, opposition reply, you can begin.
All right. Panel, we think this debate needs to be judged on two key themes. The first is a likelihood of conflict and exploitation in our world versus side proposition's world. And the second is the quality of life for citizens in our interplanetary federation versus their interplanetary federation. So let's talk about theme 1, the likelihood of conflict and exploitation. In their world, the same incentives that create exploitation and create conflict today still exist. That is the lack of access to resources or the wish to monopolize resources. When countries want to monopolize more resources, they're going to invade the weaker countries in order to gain control over them. This is literally the essence of colonization in the 1600s and remains the extent of colonization today, when we literally see large multinational corporations exploiting workers and exploiting the natural resources of Africa and Asia. In their world, the incentives that drive this exploitation still exist. The incentives of lack of access to resources and the incentives of monopoly power. Our counterfactual is this. In a world where everyone has equal access to material goods, where everyone sort of has everything that they could possibly want material-wise, the need for exploitation and the need to invade and colonize another country, or another planet rather, just doesn't exist anymore because you already have the material resources. We think that the likelihood of conflict is actually lower. Their response to this is like, look, like anyone can print off a nuke and countries don't care about like, whether they're wasting weapons or not. Like, first of all, we think that like this is generally not what countries care about when they're going into war. It's not whether it's like a waste of weapons, but rather about the necessity of war. We think that countries in general are inclined to be more peaceful, and planets are sort of inclined to veer towards peaceful unless conflict and war is absolutely necessary, because we know that that will mean losing citizens one way or another. We also talked about how interpersonally, when they say like, look, everyone's going to just print off an AK-47 or a nuclear weapon, we're going to say like, look, if we have the ability to just wish things into existence, we're going to have the ability to find out when those things are existent, and we're going to have a more robust crime fighting source. All right, let's move on to the second theme, quality of life. So both sides concede that like, look, probably in the 24th century, people are going to have access to like the most basic things like food and water. So this debate needs to be decided on things like personal fulfillment and what results in a better world for people. They say, look, like I get satisfaction from owning things that other people don't own. I get satisfaction for saving up for a pair of Ray-Bans or like saving up for a MacBook, etc. And we say, sure, like there is some amount of satisfaction from that, but we say that that's far outweighed by the hedonic treadmill of like capitalism basically saying, I want a bigger house, I want more cars, etc., because it doesn't lead to personal satisfaction. No matter how much you have, there will not be personal satisfaction in a materialist world, because the wish is always to have more than the other person. My partner also talked about how like it'll actually lead to more innovation that's driven not by profit incentives, but actually by making the world a better place. Ladies and gentlemen, we went on the two key themes of quality life and reduce the likelihood of conflict. So proud to oppose.
Thank you. That's 3 minutes and 30 seconds. And then we move on to the proposition reply to close out today's debate. Whenever you're ready, you can begin.
All right. Starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You have a side opposition that has already conceded to losing this debate and wants to scapegoat every clash through just claiming to have a technology that fixes it. Note none of this is put in their info slides, and they fundamentally lost today's debate. Two main things in today's reply. I'm going to be showing the strategic errors that have made them lose this debate, and secondly, I'll be showing you the main clashes in today's debate. First one, off the bat in their 0-1, they concede to the fact that if you have access to large-scale weapons, they already lose. There's no way to guarantee that no one will produce it illegally if they have access to it, or if we're in a failing conflict to just use it, or if you're crazy, that's going to lose them this debate, and they've conceded that they've already lost on their grounds alone. But let's move on and considering that's not the case. Secondly, the entire responses are made up of cases say, well, we think there would be technology. Note there's nowhere stated in the info slide that that technology itself would exist, and that's dependent on one thing not existing, which often happens with innovation that accelerates in certain places and not in others. They already lose the debate because they think the issues are severe enough to lose on their own that they try to scapegoat clashes. Finally, they hinge their case that there's be no form of conflict whatsoever because there are no resources. Let me just clearly show you why that's wrong. Firstly, religion is one of the most prominent sources of conflict. Look at the Crusades. Secondly, personal opinions on what should be done or how we should govern a country or what rules should be in place. Thirdly, personal differences or violence still takes place. A conflict between two individuals isn't dependent on resources, it's dependent on our relationship. Based on that alone, they lose this debate. But let's go into the main clashes. Firstly, danger. Note that they've never engaged in the points of armed groups themselves or our ability to control and regulate products that pose a risk to addiction from government's perspective. The only real engagement we get is on the individual level where say we can police the production. Note, these things are still going to need to create violence in order to deal with them. You can't police them properly because we have access to the same technology you do. And even if you could, there's still cases of illegality in terms of production. Next, they claim that their fight for resources and colonization is exponentially worse. Note at the point where you don't have access to this, we think conflict is generally lowered because you don't have the same easy access to weapons and armament. But also on the second level, we told you that you have patents for certain products that people are going to try and hoard as smaller planets, which will lead to the same kind of conflict for a resource. It might not be physical, but it'll be intellectual. That means on the comparative way up in terms of life satisfaction, we think we're significantly better because the cost of life is worse on our side. The lack of engagement shows why they lose that point. Next clash, terms of efficiency. Note they've conceded the fact that basic necessities will be commonly available, means that no one will be in abject poverty or suffering. Their only case is for monopolies, which were contradicting in their two speeches. Note at the point where there is an abundance of resources, the barriers to entry is extremely low, meaning that there'll still be competition, and the formations of monopolies are unlikely. Even in the most severe industries, likely oligopolies still happen. Finally, we told you that we can mitigate this through satisfaction of getting your own products. On the final level of cash, we're going to tell you that competition is severely better. We told you about profit incentives and how that's essential in terms of organizing labor and forcing people to do more work. Secondly, with no profit incentives, we're likely not to see that. And thirdly, we told you there'd be no shares of patents themselves. The only response we get is that people will still do this because they're altruistic. Note that's not mutually exclusive. In the case where people are altruistic and government funds things, that's going to happen on either side of the house. If that's their only mechanism, comparatively, we have more. On the conclusion of this debate, you must recognize that there's an existential threat to human life that they've run from engaging with this entire debate. And if you care about progress, you stand with side proposition.
Thank you. That was 3 minutes and 29 seconds. And so therefore we conclude the grand finals debate of WIDPSC 2021. We thank you again for